Morning, October 7th, 1916. Sevastopol Bay. The ship lies at anchor, alive, formidable, invincible. Around it lie Allied vessels. On the shore, thousands of people. And then, an explosion. Not in battle, not under enemy fire. The Imperatritsa Mariya, Empress Mariya, begins to burn right in her home harbor. And sink. In 45 minutes, she will go to the bottom, taking 228 people with her. You think you know this story? You don't know the half of it. Because behind the loss of the Imperatritsa Mariya stands something greater than a tragic accident. There are spies here. There are secret archives that no one was allowed to read for decades. There is a man who was arrested and quietly released. And there is evidence that the Soviet government classified immediately after raising the ship from the seabed. Watch until the end, because today, we are reopening this case. But to understand why the loss of the Imperatritsa Mariya shook an entire empire, we need to go back. To the moment when this steel monster was just being born, and to the race that spawned it. Portsmouth, England, His Majesty's dockyard. A ship slowly slides into the waters of the Solent. It was named HMS Dreadnought, and the moment it touched the water, every other navy on the planet became obsolete in a single second. Imagine that. All the countries of the world, Germany, France, Japan, Russia, the USA, had been building fleets for years, spending billions, training crews, and in one day, all of it turned into scrap metal, because one British ship rewrote the rules of war at sea. Why was it so dangerous? Before the Dreadnought, battleships carried guns of different calibers, large, medium, small. This created confusion in battle. Different shell speeds, different trajectories, different ranges. Aiming was nearly impossible. The Dreadnought simplified everything to a terrifying elegance. Only guns of one, the largest, caliber. 10 barrels of 305 millimeters. A broadside from this single ship was equal to the broadside of an entire squadron of older ships. The world went mad. Germany began building its own dreadnoughts, followed by Austria-Hungary, Japan, Italy, the USA. It wasn't just an arms race, it was panic in steel and smoke. Every power understood. Whoever has the most dreadnoughts controls the seas, and whoever controls the seas controls world trade, colonies, and the very geopolitics of the planet. Russia could not stay on the sidelines. But here began a specific headache for St. Petersburg. Russia had 3 fleets, the Baltic, the Pacific, and the Black Sea, and they could never unite. A ship from the Baltic could not get to the Black Sea. The Ottoman Empire controlled the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits and did not let warships pass. Russia had already lost its Pacific fleet. In the Battle of Tsushima in 1905, the Japanese destroyed it almost completely. It was a national trauma the country had not forgotten. That left the Black Sea. And here, pay attention, is where the most interesting part begins. The Black Sea seemed like a safe internal body of water, a Russian lake, you could say. But that was an illusion, because on the other shore sat the Ottoman Empire, weakening but unpredictable. And behind its back, the shadow of Germany was already looming. Russia began building Black Sea dreadnoughts, 3 ships. The first and main one was named in honor of the mother of the last Tsar, Imperatritsa Mariya. And that is when someone in Berlin started to get nervous. Because a new Russian dreadnought in the Black Sea changed everything. It threatened Turkish ports. It cut off supply lines. It made Russia the mistress of these waters, which meant it had to be stopped, at any cost. But first, it had to be built, and that turned out to be a task worthy of its own story. Nikolaev, 1911, a port city in the south of the Russian Empire, where the Ingol River flows into the southern Bug. Here, on the slipways of the Rewrote factory, they began assembling the ship, rivet by rivet, plate by plate. Thousands of workers in smoke and thunder, day after day, month after month. What is a dreadnought in numbers? It is an abstraction until you translate it into images. The length of the Imperatritsa Mariya was 168 meters. That is roughly 1.5 football fields laid end to end. Displacement? 23,000 tons. A weight that is hard to even imagine. The armor of the main belt, 260 millimeters of steel. A shell that failed to pierce it weighed almost as much as a small car. The main battery, 12 guns and 4 turrets. Each barrel, 305 millimeters. Each shell, 470 kilograms of pure destructive power. At a distance of 20 kilometers, these guns could send any enemy ship to the bottom before it even had time to aim in return. It wasn't just a machine of war. It was a statement. Russia was telling the whole world, and primarily Germany and the Ottoman Empire, that the Black Sea was now hers. That she set the rules here. Construction proceeded under strict secrecy. Foreign observers were not allowed into the shipyard. Technical specifications were not published even for Entente allies. British intelligence requested data. St. Petersburg politely evaded the answer. The ship was supposed to be a surprise, an ace up the sleeve that the enemy wouldn't know about in advance. But secrets in a port city are a precarious thing. Thousands of people worked at the shipyard. Engineers, welders, riveters, laborers. People came and went. Among them were foreign specialists. German engineers hired before the war, back when Russia and Germany were just neighbors, not enemies. Some of them left. Some stayed. And here begins the part of the story that official sources preferred not to discuss. Even during construction, minor incidents were recorded at the shipyard. Small fires in storage rooms, damage to equipment, disappearance of technical documentation. Each case by itself was explained simply. Negligence, an accident, the usual chaos of a massive construction site. But if you looked at them all together, the picture began to look different. This wasn't spoken of aloud. It was written off as chance. They continued to build. In June 1915, the Imperatritsa Mariya was commissioned into the Black Sea Fleet, almost a year behind the original schedule. The official reason? Difficulties of wartime. Russia was already at war by then. Admirals, officials, and officers gathered for the launching ceremony. The orchestra played. Flags waved. Someone present wrote in their diary, "It was impossible not to feel pride. This ship seemed invincible." Seemed. Because somewhere in that crowd, among the uniforms and dress coats, perhaps stood a man who already knew. The ship would never fulfill its mission. A man who was already working on it. But that comes a bit later. First, the Imperatritsa Mariya had to fight. And fight she did. Oh, how she fought. Summer 1915. The Black Sea. Smoke on the horizon. The Turkish cruiser Midilli, the former German Breslau, is steaming full speed along the Anatolian coast. Fast, maneuverable, dangerous. It had escaped Russian ships more than once. Its captain knew these waters like the back of his hand. This time, everything was different. A silhouette appeared on the horizon. Massive. Low. With turrets of the main caliber turned toward the target. The Imperatritsa Mariya was moving into position. The Turkish captain gave the order. Full speed ahead. Retreat. Immediately. He made it, but barely. And from that moment on, the Turkish command learned a simple rule. Wherever the Imperatritsa Mariya is, do not go there. This was exactly the effect for which the ship was built. Not just to fight, but to crush with its very presence. Strategic deterrence, as we would call it today. The Mariya patrolled the Black Sea, and the mere fact of her existence was enough to make the Turkish-German forces think twice before every exit from the Bosphorus. During her first year of service, the ship participated in the bombardment of the coal ports of Zonguldak and Kozlu on the Turkish coast. These ports supplied Constantinople with coal, fuel for the entire war machine of the Ottoman Empire. Destroying them meant choking the enemy slowly but surely. The shells of the Imperatritsa Mariya did their job. And then, he took command of the Black Sea Fleet. Alexander Vasilyevich Kolchak. 41 years old, polar explorer, hero of the Russo-Japanese War, one of the most brilliant naval officers of his generation, a man who didn't know how to do anything half-heartedly. Kolchak idolized the Imperatritsa Mariya. For him, she was not just a flagship, she was the instrument of the war he wanted to wage. Aggressive, offensive, without looking back at losses. He personally planned operations from the ship's bridge. He personally went out to sea when other admirals preferred staff offices. The crew adored him, or feared him, or both at the same time. Under Kolchak's command, the Imperatritsa Mariya became even more aggressive. Raids became more frequent. The engagement distance with the enemy shortened. The admiral wanted results, and he got them. In the spring of 1916, the Black Sea Fleet under his leadership conducted a series of operations that effectively locked the Turkish fleet in the Bosphorus. The Goeben, the most powerful German battlecruiser in the theater of operations, came out less and less. The initiative belonged to Russia. Kolchak reported to Petrograd. The situation on the Black Sea is under control. The Imperatritsa Mariya is invincible. He believed it. He truly believed it. And here we must stop and ask a question that is rarely asked. Not what happened to the ship, but another question, a more uncomfortable one. Who was hindered by this invincibility? The answer was already ready. In quiet offices, in port taverns, in letters written in cipher and sent through neutral countries. While Kolchak planned new operations, other people were planning their own, and their time was running out. Let's talk about espionage. For real. Not the espionage shown in movies. Not people in black trench coats sneaking through night streets. Real espionage is boring. It is patient. It hides among perfectly ordinary people whom you see every day and never notice. German intelligence during World War I was, without exaggeration, the best in the world. Department 3B of the German General Staff, a structure whose existence most people then did not even suspect, wove nets of agents all over Europe. In neutral countries, in enemy ports, behind enemy lines. Russia was a special area of focus. Why? Because Russia was vulnerable. A huge country with thousands of kilometers of borders, a diverse population, weak counterintelligence, and traditional Russian laxity in matters of secrecy. German agents had been working here for a long time, even before the war, when no one thought the two countries would end up on opposite sides of the front. The south was of particular interest. Black Sea ports. The shipyards of Nikolaev and Sevastopol. And here begins the part of the story I want to tell you very carefully. Because here facts intertwine with theories, and theories with speculation. I will clearly state where one ends and the other begins. Fact 1. German intelligence knew about the construction of the Imperatritsa Mariya. This is not a guess. It is confirmed by German archival documents declassified in the 20th century. Berlin closely monitored Russia's Black Sea shipbuilding program. Fact 2. An intelligence network was operating in Nikolaev and Sevastopol. Small, patient, oriented specifically toward the fleet. And now, the theory. A theory that investigators developed very seriously. Its center was one man, Verman. A German by origin, living in Nikolaev. According to his official biography, an ordinary merchant, a man engaged in trade in a port city where trade was the main occupation of everyone. Unremarkable, standing out in no way. But Verman had connections, wide, branching connections among the workers of the Nikolaev shipyards. He knew people. He treated them to drinks. He lent money. He was, as they say, one of the guys. And he had contacts in Germany, regular ones, even after the war began. Investigators didn't pay attention to him immediately. Verman knew how to be invisible. But when they started pulling the thread, the ball of yarn turned out to be large. The scheme was simple and elegant. Through intermediaries, Verman reached out to crew members and shipyard workers. He didn't recruit them directly as spies. That's too dangerous. He simply paid for small favors. Carry something on board. Leave something in the right place. Look the other way at the right moment. None of these people might have even understood what they were a part of. This is why real espionage is so hard to uncover. Was Vermin a real agent of German intelligence? Or just a convenient figure to pin everything on? This question remains open to this day. He was arrested, interrogated, and then the case strangely stalled. But more on that later. Right now, something else is important. While investigators were unraveling this tangle after the catastrophe, the morning of October 7, 1916, was inevitably approaching. On the Imperatritsa Mariya, 1,200 people lived and served. They cleaned guns, stood watch, wrote letters home. They didn't know that the clock was already ticking. 6:20 a.m., October 7, 1916. Sevastopol Bay wakes up slowly. The autumn dawn over Crimea is pale, almost white. The water in the bay is dark and calm. Ships stand in the roadstead. Among them, the Imperatritsa Mariya, the flagship, the pride of the fleet. On board, a typical morning on a warship is underway. Watch change. The smell of boiler smoke and sea salt. Some sailors are washing up on deck. Someone is carrying breakfast to the wardroom. Someone is dozing in the last minutes before reveille. It is an ordinary morning. Completely ordinary. And then, a sound. Not an explosion immediately. First, a dull thud from inside the hull, as if someone hit a giant metal drum with a sledgehammer. A few seconds of silence. And then, a second sound. Louder. Sharper. And then, the explosion. It erupted from the forward magazines, those very compartments deep inside the ship where gunpowder for the main caliber guns was stored. A pillar of fire rose higher than the masts. Eyewitnesses on the shore later said it was visible from kilometers away. The flame was so bright that for a second it became as light as day, although the sun had barely risen above the horizon. On neighboring ships, people ran out onto the decks. What is happening? No one understood. The first seconds were pure shock. The brain refuses to accept what the eyes see. The flagship is burning. The flagship is burning. On board the Imperatritsa Mariya, hell was breaking loose in those seconds. The first explosion ripped open the bow of the ship. Bulkheads between compartments, those watertight partitions that were supposed to save the ship during damage, were powerless against the fire inside. Flames spread through ventilation shafts, through cable corridors, through any crack where air could pass. And down there, in the magazines, lay thousands of kilograms of gunpowder. Officers tried to organize the crew, shouted orders, tried to open the Kingston valves, special valves to flood the magazines, the last line of defense against exactly this situation. If you manage to flood the magazines with water before the fire reaches the next batch of gunpowder, the ship can be saved. They didn't make it. At 6:25 a.m., 5 minutes after the first explosion, the second magazine blew. This explosion was different. Not just loud, monstrous. It was heard in the city. Windows blew out in houses on the embankment. People on the streets were knocked down by the shockwave. The ship began to list. Slowly, almost majestically, as if reluctantly, the Imperatritsa Mariya began to roll onto her starboard side. Those who were on deck clung to whatever came to hand. Gun turrets, railings, each other. Some jumped into the water. The water in the October Bay was cold, almost freezing. A surviving sailor, Timofey Kodarev, later recalled, and these words were preserved in the investigative files, that at the moment of the second explosion, he was standing on the upper deck. He was thrown against the side. When he got up and looked forward, the bow of the ship practically no longer existed. There was only flame. "Jump!" someone shouted next to him. "Jump, she's sinking!" Kodarev jumped. He survived. Many did not. Lifeboats from neighboring ships were heading to the Mariya at full speed. But the situation was terrifying. The ship was burning. At any moment, another magazine could blow. Getting close meant risking one's own vessel and crew. But people in the water were drowning right now. The rescuers went in, despite everything. At 7:16 a.m., almost exactly 1 hour after the first explosion, the Imperatritsa Mariya turned keel up and began to go to the bottom. Those who still remained on board slipped into the water. The ship went down quickly, a giant mass of metal that nothing could hold back anymore. 228 people died that morning. More than 200 others received injuries and burns. Some of them died in hospitals in the following days. But here is what is strange. Among the survivors was one man. His name is given differently in different sources, so let's just call him the warrant officer from the forward watch, who gave testimony to investigators. And in this testimony was one detail that hooked the investigators immediately. He said that shortly before the first explosion, he saw a man in the area of the forward magazines. A man who shouldn't have been there. Not at that time, not in that place. He didn't have time to call out to him, nor to make out his face. And then, everything exploded. This testimony entered the investigation files. Whether it was the truth, a memory error of a shocked man, or something else, was never established. But it was with this detail that the most important question of the entire investigation began. Was it an accident or not? Kolchak learned of the explosion a few minutes after the first strike. He was on the shore, at headquarters. And when they reported to him, "Flagship is burning," he, according to the recollections of his adjutant, simply stood for a few seconds, silently. Then, he took his cap and walked out. He personally directed the rescue operation from the shore, personally gave orders to the lifeboats, personally met the survivors at the pier. Those who saw him that morning said his face was like stone, not a single emotion on the outside, but his eyes were different. When the last survivor was pulled from the water, Kolchak did two things. First, he sent a telegram to Petrograd, dry, official. Battleship Imperatritsa Mariya lost due to internal explosion. Investigation begun. Second, he personally headed the investigative commission. This was an unusual step. A fleet commander investigating the catastrophe of his own flagship himself. But Kolchak didn't trust anyone else with this. He wanted to know the truth. He truly wanted to know. The commission worked quickly and methodically. They interrogated all survivors, studied the ship's design, requested documents from the shipyard, analyzed the nature of the explosion, where it started, how it spread, what burned first. And very quickly it became clear. The location of the first explosion was determined precisely. The forward artillery magazine. The compartment where the powder for the main caliber guns was stored. But then the questions began. Why did the gunpowder explode? Theory 1. Spontaneous combustion. Gunpowder is unstable, especially if stored incorrectly, at high humidity or temperature. The Russian fleet in those years used pyroxylin-based powder, a substance capricious and demanding of storage conditions. Other navies of the world had already recorded cases of spontaneous combustion of exactly this powder. The French battleship Liberté exploded in 1911 for the same reason. The Italian Leonardo da Vinci in 1916. A coincidence? Or a systemic problem of an entire era? This theory was convenient. No one is to blame. A tragic accident. You can close the case and move on. Theory 2. Negligence. On warships of that time, rules for handling gunpowder were strict, but they were broken. Smoking in prohibited places, careless handling of equipment, open fire near the magazines. Investigators found witnesses who spoke of disciplinary violations on board. Minor, insignificant, but violations. And this theory was relatively convenient. Specific people are to blame. They can be punished. An accident caused by human error. Theory 3. Sabotage. Here the commission stepped onto shaky ground. The testimony of the warrant officer about the stranger in the magazines was documented. Investigators checked the watch logs. Who had access to the bow of the ship the night before the explosion and in the morning? They found discrepancies, small ones, but they were there. In parallel, they began to develop the intelligence angle. That was when Vermin first came into the investigation's view. His connections to the shipyard in Nikolaev, his contacts, his financial operations. Kolchak personally read every interrogation, every document. And the further he read, the more the sabotage theory seemed to him not just possible, but probable. But it was impossible to prove. Do you understand the problem? The explosion destroyed the evidence, literally burned it. The place where the source of the fire could have been, the forward magazine, ceased to exist as a physical object. Witnesses either died or were in a state of shock and gave contradictory testimony. That very stranger, seen by the warrant officer, was never identified. The commission worked for 3 months. In the end, it came to a conclusion that formally was not a conclusion. The official report stated roughly the following. It is impossible to establish the exact cause of the explosion. 3 equally probable versions are being considered: spontaneous combustion of gunpowder, negligence of personnel, malicious intent. None of them can be either confirmed or ruled out. The case formally remained open. In practice, it was closed. Kolchak was furious. According to the recollections of people in his circle, he considered this conclusion a capitulation. He was convinced, personally convinced, that the ship was destroyed intentionally. But an admiral's conviction and an investigation's evidence base are different things. And then the revolution broke out. February 1917 swept away the old regime. Kolchak was removed from command. Then, October. The Bolsheviks. Civil War. Kolchak became the supreme ruler of Russia, fought against Soviet power, and in February 1920 was executed in Irkutsk. The case of the Imperatritsa Mariya got lost in this chaos. Investigation materials settled in archives. Vermin, according to some data, was quietly released under the new government. Where he went after that is unknown. It would seem that's it. The story is over. But the ship still lay at the bottom of Sevastopol Bay. And 20 years later, people went down to it again. What they found opened this case once more. Sevastopol, Soviet Union. 17 years had passed since the catastrophe. The empire no longer exists. Kolchak is shot. Vermin has vanished. The world survived one world war and was preparing, without knowing it, for a second. And on the bottom of Sevastopol Bay, at a depth of 18 meters, lay the Imperatritsa Mariya, turned keel up, in silt and darkness. 17 years. The Soviet government decided to raise the ship, not out of historical interest, out of purely practical considerations. The country needed metal. The steel of a dreadnought, thousands of tons of high-quality naval armor, represented immense value for the rapidly industrializing USSR. But before cutting the ship for scrap, it had to be raised. The task was colossal. An overturned battleship displacing 23,000 tons, lying on the bottom for almost 2 decades. Silt filled all compartments. The hull had rusted in places. Divers worked in pitch darkness, navigating only by touch. The job was entrusted to EPRON, the Expedition of Underwater Works of Special Purpose. It was a Soviet organization that specialized in exactly such tasks. Professional, experienced, used to working in difficult conditions. And here begins the part of the story that is almost never talked about. EPRON divers working inside the hull compiled detailed reports on what they saw, the state of the bulkheads, the nature of the damage, specifics of destruction in different compartments. These reports went up the chain of command, and at some level of this chain, they disappeared into folders stamped secret. Why? Let's figure out what the divers could have seen there and why it was important. A gunpowder explosion is a specific phenomenon. It leaves characteristic traces: the direction of the blast wave, the nature of metal deformation, how the space around the epicenter burned out. An experienced specialist, having studied these traces, can say with a high degree of accuracy, was the explosion initiated from the inside or outside? Was the source of ignition accidental or intentional? Was there one source or several? EPRON divers saw these traces with their own eyes, and what they saw, judging by indirect data, by how the leadership reacted, by what was classified and what wasn't, did not quite correspond to the version of accidental, spontaneous combustion. But we have no direct evidence, because those very reports, classified, put away in folders, are either still not fully declassified or were destroyed. This in itself says a lot. Or it says nothing at all, if you are prone to skepticism. I invite you to decide for yourselves. The raising of the ship was completed in 1935. It was an outstanding engineering operation, one of the largest raisings of sunken ships in history at that time. The Imperatritsa Mariya was put into dry dock, examined, and they began to dismantle her for metal. The pride of the Black Sea Fleet turned into raw material. But before closing this page, I want to show you something. Something that made me look at this whole story differently. Open any serious book on the naval history of World War I. Find the section on fleet losses, and look at the list of ships lost not in battle, but from internal explosions. French battleship Liberté, 1911. Toulon. Explosion in the powder magazine. 212 dead. Official cause? Spontaneous combustion of gunpowder. Italian battleship Leonardo da Vinci, 1916. Toronto. Explosion in the forward magazine. 248 dead. Official cause? Remained open for a long time. Later, Italian investigators leaned toward the version of Austrian sabotage. Japanese battleship Mikasa, 1905. Sasebo. Magazine explosion. 251 dead. Official cause? Accident. British battleship Bulwark, 1914. Sheerness. Internal explosion. 739 dead. Official cause? Accidental detonation of ammunition. British battleship Natal, 1915. Cromarty. Internal explosion. 400 dead. Cause? Not definitively established. Do you see the pattern? I see the pattern. Now, attention. This is where one must be very careful, because a pattern does not mean a conspiracy. All these catastrophes could have one common explanation, unrelated to espionage at all. Gunpowder. The pyroxylin powder used by the fleets of all great powers in the early 20th century was an unstable substance. All specialists knew this. Its stability depended on storage conditions, humidity, temperature, production quality. On ships of that time, control over storage conditions was, to put it mildly, imperfect. Maybe, just maybe, all these explosions were the logical result of thousands of tons of unstable substance being transported on ships around the world. Statistical inevitability. But here is what is interesting in the case of the Leonardo da Vinci. The Italian investigation conducted after the war established with high probability sabotage. Austrian intelligence, an agent who had access to the ship. The method of detonation, a slow-acting ignition initiator, which gave the perpetrator time to leave the ship long before the explosion. A slow-acting ignition initiator, a device that leaves no traces, that burns up along with everything else, that is impossible to find after the catastrophe. Exactly such a device, if it was used on the Imperatritsa Mariya, would explain everything. The absence of evidence, the impossibility of establishing the cause, and the testimony of the warrant officer about the stranger in the magazines. But this is a theory, one of three. And now the time has come to deal with all of them, for real. Weigh each one, and try to answer the question that has hung over this story for more than 100 years. What actually happened to the Imperatritsa Mariya? Okay, let's speak honestly. I have spent a lot of time with this story. Read archival documents, investigation materials, memoirs of survivors, technical expertise. Talk to people who studied this catastrophe professionally. And now, I want to do something that is rarely done in documentaries about historical mysteries. I want to be completely honest with you. We don't know the truth. We don't know it precisely, definitively, and irrevocably. Anyone who tells you otherwise is either mistaken or selling you a beautiful story instead of a real one. But we can weigh the theories. Seriously, for real. Not like in a detective show where the villain is revealed in the finale and everything falls into place. But as real historians do, with probabilities, caveats, and an honest admission of what we don't know. So, Theory 1. Spontaneous combustion of gunpowder. This is the simplest version, and at the same time, the most technically grounded. The pyroxylin powder used by the Imperial Russian Navy was an unstable substance. This is not an opinion, it is a chemical fact. Under certain conditions, high temperature, excessive humidity, mechanical impact, It could ignite on its own, without any external source of fire. On the Imperatritsa Mariya, gunpowder storage conditions raised questions. Investigation documents recorded that high humidity was periodically noted in the magazines. Ventilation systems worked intermittently. The temperature regime was not always strictly observed. The ship was actively exploited. Constant sorties, firing, hull vibrations. Add to this the human factor. Crew fatigue after a year of active combat. Dulling of vigilance, which inevitably comes with getting used to danger. Minor violations that no one took seriously because they didn't lead to consequences. Until the time came. And here you have a picture where no malicious intent is needed. Just physics. Just chemistry. Just tired people on a tired ship with an unstable substance in the hold. Statistics also speak in favor of this version. We have already listed the ships: Liberté, Leonardo da Vinci, Bulwark, Natal. If we explain their loss only by sabotage, we must assume the existence of a very extensive and very successful international network of agents that simultaneously worked against the French, Italian, British, and Russian fleets. This is possible, but it requires a huge number of assumptions. Occam's razor says, choose the explanation that requires fewer assumptions. Unstable gunpowder requires none. It is a strong theory. Honestly, very strong. But, Theory 2. Negligence with tragic consequences. This version does not contradict the first, it complements it. Gunpowder could have self-ignited, but it could also have ignited from an accidental source of fire appearing where fire should not be. The investigation recorded several alarming details. Testimony from a number of survivors indicated that rules for handling open fire near magazines were violated. Not grossly, not demonstratively, but violated. Someone smoked where they shouldn't have. Someone used a faulty lantern. Someone left a hatch open that should have been dogged down. On a warship in conditions of active war, discipline inevitably degrades. Not because people are bad, but because they are alive. They get used to it. They get tired. They start thinking, one time is okay. Nothing will happen. It happens. Another point speaks in favor of this version. Kolchak's commission, for all his personal conviction in sabotage, could not prove it. Professional investigators, motivated personally by the commander, working on hot trails, found no solid evidence of intent. This is hard to ignore. Negligence explains everything, and requires no spies. And yet, Theory 3. Sabotage. I will tell you straight. This version is the most attractive. It has spies, secret agents, and international conspiracy. It captivates. It makes the heart beat a little faster. And that is precisely why it must be approached with particular caution. Because the attractiveness of a theory is not an argument in its favor. But there are arguments. Real ones. First, German intelligence had a motive. An absolutely clear, ironclad motive. The Imperatritsa Mariya controlled the Black Sea and threatened Turkish ports through which supplies for Germany's ally, the Ottoman Empire, flowed. Eliminating this ship meant radically changing the balance of power in an entire theater of operations. This is not speculation. This is the strategic reality of 1916. Second, German intelligence had the opportunity. An agent network in Black Sea ports existed. Vermin is a real figure, really connected to the shipyard and circles close to the fleet. The investigation could not prove his involvement, but could not disprove it either. Third, the Italian precedent. The Leonardo da Vinci died under circumstances strikingly similar to the loss of the Imperatritsa Mariya. Explosion in the forward magazine. Rapid flooding. Official cause initially, accident. Final conclusion of the Italian investigation, Austrian sabotage using a slow-acting ignition initiator. If the scheme worked against the Italian fleet, why couldn't it be applied against the Russian one? Fourth, and this is perhaps the most important, the warrant officer's testimony about the stranger in the magazines, a man who shouldn't have been there. This testimony is in the investigation materials. No one refuted it. They simply couldn't confirm it. But there are counter-arguments. The testimony of one shocked person is an unreliable source. Memory works unpredictably under stress. The man could have been mistaken, could have confused the time, could have seen someone who had the right to be there, but simply wasn't entered in the watch log due to that same negligence. Vermin could have been just a merchant with German roots, who ended up in the wrong place at the wrong time. The classified EPRO reports could have contained anything, or nothing fundamentally important. Soviet authorities classified a huge number of documents, not because they held a sensation, but simply out of a habit of secrecy. And here I stand before you with 3 versions. Each of them explains what happened. None of them explains it completely. But here is what I will tell you personally. As a person who has spent a lot of time with this story, one detail won't let me go. Not the spies, not Verman, not the classified reports. Here is what won't let me go. Time. The Imperatritsa Mariya was commissioned in 1915. She fought for just over a year, and in that year, she effectively locked the Turkish-German fleet in the Bosphorus. Her influence on the situation in the Black Sea was huge and obvious to all participants, and she exploded in October 1916, exactly when her strategic importance was at its maximum, exactly when her presence was most painfully felt by the enemy. Accidents choose bad timing. Sabotage chooses the best timing. This is not proof. This is an observation, but it gives me no peace. And you know what? I think it shouldn't give you peace either. Because stories that end without an answer teach us something important. They teach us to live with uncertainty, to accept that the world is more complex than we would like. 228 people died. The ship went to the bottom. The guilty, if there were any, were never named. That is the truth. The only truth we know for sure. The rest, history is silent for now. What happened to those who were part of this story? Kolchak, the man who wanted the truth most of all and never got it. After the revolution, he led the White Movement, became the supreme ruler of Russia, fought against the Bolsheviks for 3 years. In February 1920, he was executed on the bank of the Ushakovka River in Irkutsk. His body was thrown under the ice. He was 45 years old. He never closed the case of the Imperatritsa Mariya. He didn't have time. Verman. Here the story breaks off almost completely. According to some data, he was released from custody in the chaos of the revolutionary years. Where he went after is unknown. No confirmed traces after 1917. The man simply dissolved, as if he never existed. Surviving sailors and officers went to different fates. Some fought in the Civil War, on the side of the Reds. Some on the side of the Whites. Some immigrated. Some settled in Soviet Russia and kept silent about the past, because the past was a dangerous topic. Timofey Kodarev, that very sailor who jumped into the October water and survived, according to available data, lived until the 1950s. What he said in private conversations, we know nothing. And the ship itself? After being raised in 1935, it was cut for metal in Sevastopol. Armor plates, gun turrets, mechanisms, everything went to smelting. Part of this metal, according to some data, was used in the construction of Soviet ships. Perhaps the steel of the Imperatritsa Mariya went out to sea again, but under a red flag, under a different name, remembering nothing of itself. The ship's anchor has been preserved. It is still in Sevastopol. If you find yourself there, find it. Touch the metal with your hands. It remembers. Here is what amazes me most in this story. Not the explosion, not the spies, not the unsolved case, but how quickly might vanishes. Russia built this ship for years, invested colossal money, the labor of thousands of people, national pride, and the strategic ambitions of an entire empire. The Imperatritsa Mariya was a symbol that Russia is a great naval power, that the Black Sea is her sea, that no one would dare. 45 minutes. That is how long it took for all of it to disappear. 45 minutes, and there is no ship, no 228 people, no strategic advantage, no symbol. Only water remained, and a question to which there is no answer. I think about this when I read news about the naval fleets of today, about new ships called unsinkable. about new weapon systems called invincible, about new symbols of power into which billions are poured. History knows only one ending for any ship. The question is always only how and when. The Imperatritsa Mariya gave us the answer to the question when too early. The answer to the question how she took with her to the bottom. And maybe, precisely in this, lies the main lesson of this story. Not in spies and not in powder magazines, but in the fact that the biggest secrets sometimes remain secrets forever. And we are left only to stand on the shore, look at the water, and think about those who went with the ship. 228 people. Remember this number, not as a statistic, as people.